Hi, welcome to Daily Readings with Pastor Nate. Today we're on Matthew chapter 22. So if you haven't read that already, please pause the video, pull out your favorite Bible, and do that now. If you'd like to read it online, I'll include a URL in the description below so that you can do that. But please take a minute to pray and do that reading, and then come back and start the video over. Well, you don't have to start over, just unpause it. All right, hopefully you've done that. This chapter picks up right where chapter 21 left off. Jesus has been teaching in parables, and really, I guess even more than teaching, he's kind of been speaking out against the religious leaders of his day through these parables. And he continues that with one more parable. He tells us this parable about a wedding banquet that's been prepared, and when the king sends out his messengers to gather in all of these guests who have been invited, the guests don't come. Some of them just don't care, they don't listen, they make excuses, they go off to do other things, and some of them actually mistreat them or even kill the messengers. And Jesus is speaking against the Jewish people, or at least the ones who don't care or are opposed to his arrival. There are Jews who are apathetic, who are disinterested in what Jesus is doing, and then you have this whole other set, like these religious leaders that he's interacting with, that are largely threatened by what he's doing, who are opposed to John's ministry, who are opposed to Jesus' own ministry. And so you have these people who had been invited for centuries. The Messiah had been promised to them. The blessings that come through the Messiah, the salvation that comes from the Messiah had been promised to them, but they oppose it when he arrives, or they don't even care that he's arrived because they're caught up in their business or their home or their finances or whatever. Then those things seem more important to them than the fact that the Messiah has come. And so they're going to miss out on what had been promised, because the king who's setting up the banquet, it says, well, if they're not going to come, then forget them. And in fact, the ones who had mistreated the messengers, judgment is poured out on them, and the cities, their cities, are destroyed, it says in the parable. So that's the bad news, right? The bad news is this invitation had gone out, and the people who failed to respond are shut out because of it, and judgment is even poured out. And that happens literally. It's not that long after Jesus' death and resurrection and ascension that the Roman Empire stomps out what remains of the kingdom of Judah, and drives the Jewish people out. So there's a literal fulfillment of this, but more importantly, it's talking about salvation, and the salvation that was to come to the Jewish people. Many of them missed out on it because they were unwilling to accept its arrival. The good news of the passage is that once those people refuse to accept the invitation, the king sends out a servant and says, just go out and invite anybody that you can find. And that's good news for us who are not ethnically Jewish. It's good news for us who were not part of the people that received that promise originally, because the invitation is extended to us because, at least in part, because the people who were originally invited didn't bother to come. And the invitation goes out from there, which is good news for the whole world. The good news for the whole world goes out in this invitation into this heavenly banquet. The end of the story, though, is challenging, right? Because the king says, go invite everybody, bring in whoever you can, and the people show up, and there's a guy who just shows up in whatever he happened to be wearing at the time, and the king's mad about it. Like, I invited you to a banquet feast, and you didn't even bother to put on appropriate clothes. You just showed up. And I think a lot of times in modern Christianity, I guess probably depends at least partially on what circles you travel in, but a lot of times in modern Christianity, we have this idea that, like, God just wants us to show up however we are. And I think that's rooted in our understanding or our misunderstanding of grace. And I don't have time to get into a lengthy conversation about it, but for a lot of churches, we've been selling very cheap grace for a long time. And it's okay to, you pray this prayer, and then one day Jesus plucks you off the earth and you get to go to heaven. And we don't ask anything of anybody. That doesn't seem to be the case in this parable, right? Like, that's exactly what this guy does. Like, he just comes as he is and makes no effort to change makes no effort to show up in an appropriate manner. And when the king sees him, he says, "What are you doing? Like, why didn't you put any effort into this?" And he throws him out. That may be a challenge for some of us in terms of how we see God or the way that we've been taught this whole thing works. But this is straight out of Jesus' mouth. Like, we got to take this seriously. We got to ask ourselves, am I putting in the appropriate effort, right? And it's weird because we know that at the end of the day, we don't earn our way into heaven. It's a gift from God. But it seems from this parable that there's strings attached to that gift, right? We don't deserve that invitation. We didn't earn that invitation. The invitation is a gift to us. But if we're going to receive it, if we're going to respond appropriately to the gift, we show up properly attired. And that means recognizing that we have some personal responsibility. Now, if you're one of my Calvinist friends, you can plug your ears for this, or we could phrase it a different way, right? If God's grace has truly been extended to you, then it will work in your life. You'll have no choice but to change your clothes, to be conformed to the image of Christ, because God's irresistible grace is at work in your life. So I guess you can still listen if you're one of my Calvinist friends. But the point here is that this isn't an invitation to just show up however we are. The invitation comes to us however we are, but there's an expectation that on the journey to the banquet, appropriate steps will be taken, appropriate growth will occur, we'll show up properly attired for the banquet. So it's a challenge for us. It should be a challenge for us because it's not enough. No matter what you've been told, no matter who told you it, it's not enough to just show up the way that you are and go from there. There's an expectation in Jesus' teaching that we're going to show up in an appropriate manner. So after this parable, we get this interaction where the religious leaders are sort of testing Jesus. And that shouldn't be surprising, right? Like, he's just given 3 parables that are clearly sort of speaking out against these religious leaders. They haven't responded appropriately to the invitation, so they're going to miss out on the banquet. And then you have the parables that we talked about last time as well, which are speaking out against these leaders too. And so the Pharisees get together and they come and they test Jesus, and they ask him this question. They're trying to trap him, so they ask him about taxes. Should we pay our taxes to Caesar? Now, I don't know exactly what outcome they were hoping for, but it was a difficult question because it had consequences either way, right? If Jesus just says, pay your taxes to Caesar, then they could maybe twist that so that it sounds like he's saying don't pay your temple tax. Their system of tithing, they had a tithe that they were supposed to bring at the harvest time, and then they also had a tax that they paid to the temple, and there were a lot of ins and outs to their system. And there's a chance that if Jesus said, yeah, be paying your taxes to Caesar, it could be misconstrued as him saying not to pay the temple tax. It could be twisted so that it sounds like he supports the Roman government, as opposed to being this figure who's going to set up a kingdom like most of the people were expecting, right? They're expecting Jesus to be a king. He just entered the city as a king. And if he's saying, well, pay your taxes to Caesar and nothing else, then that may crush that hope that some people have. Or on the other hand, if he says don't pay your taxes to Caesar, then these Pharisees can go to the Roman officials and say, hey, here's this guy telling everybody not to pay their taxes, come and take care of it. So they ask him this trick question, and the way that Jesus handles it is just flawless. He says, who's on this coin? Whose inscription is on the coin? They say, well, it's Caesar's. And he says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what is God's. And he kind of separates them and says, listen, if you're going to live in this world and you're going to use this world's currency, then pay this world's taxes. But he does it without compromising the idea that you still give to God what is God's. He's not taking anything away from the temple tax. He's not taking anything away from the tithe. He's saying, listen, pay what you owe to these worldly authorities and pay what you owe to the other worldly authority, to God's kingdom. And he doesn't get real into it, but Paul will talk more later about how we're ambassadors for Christ and how our citizenship is in heaven. And as people who are living in 2 worlds, right? Sometimes we need to figure out how to navigate that. And that's kind of what Jesus is talking about here. How do we successfully live in two worlds at once? How do we truly live as citizens of heaven while recognizing that we also are living in this world and are responsible for paying our taxes to worldly authorities and those sorts of things? So that's just something to think about a little bit. Jesus silences their questions. He gives an answer that I guess satisfies everybody, but it also sets a pattern for us. We're not supposed to just pull away and say, well, I'm not going to pay the state taxes. I'm not going to pay federal taxes because I am a citizen of heaven. Well, yeah, we are citizens of heaven, and that should define who we are and how we interact with our culture and all those things. We're ambassadors, not citizens of this earth, but also we have responsibility as people who live here and use this currency to do things like pay our taxes. So after the Pharisees fail to trap him, the Sadducees, who are the other half of the Pharisees and the Sadducees are kind of two different denominations in Judaism, and together they form the ruling council at the time. So the Pharisees fail to trap Jesus, the Sadducees decide they're going to give it a go, and they come and ask Jesus this story about, you have this woman, and she marries, and her husband dies, she has no kids, so she has to keep getting remarried, and they don't believe in the resurrection. So I think one of their hopes is that maybe Jesus is just going to say, well, no, that none of that makes any sense. And it'll be ammunition for them to say, well, look, Jesus doesn't believe in a resurrection either. Also, it may be a reference to the book of Tobit, which I don't really have time to go into. If you're like, what's Tobit? What we call the Old Testament was sort of locked in at about 400 years before Jesus came. And then the New Testament doesn't start until after he's born. So you have this 400-year window. And there's some books that were written in there that some people count as part of the Holy Scriptures and some people don't. And the book of Tobit is one of those books. And there's a story in there about a woman who has 7 husbands and no children. So part of this, maybe the Sadducees trying to get Jesus to discredit that book, which is a whole other issue. But the short version of this is that this passage makes me sad, because Jesus says there won't be any marriage in the resurrection, and I can't imagine spending eternity without my wife. But there it is. When God creates us, he says it's not good for man to be alone. Marriage is part of the plan even before the fall. But I guess there's something about our resurrection bodies, our glorified bodies, where we will no longer need a help me. We'll no longer need another half, and so we won't get married. And I hope we get to still hang out and maybe be best friends or whatever. But that's the sad reality, I guess. The resurrection is going to be awesome. Don't take this as a downer. The resurrection is going to be great. It's totally going to be worthwhile. But we still don't completely understand what this is going to look like, and apparently part of that is that we won't get married anymore. So at any rate, the Sadducees fail to trap him either, because he explains this bit about the resurrection that they didn't know. So the Pharisees come and test him one more time and say, what's the greatest commandment? He gives an answer that if you grew up in the church, you'll be very familiar with. He says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as you love yourself. And then he says all of the law and the prophets hang on these two things. So Jesus is saying these two commands are the sum of the heart of the rules that have been given. And all of these things that Jesus has said about pursuing righteousness and growing into righteousness are summed up in these two things. If we can love God with all of our heart and all of our soul and all of our mind and all of our strength, and if we can love our neighbor the way that we love ourselves, we'll be satisfying the requirements of righteousness. If you only remember one thing from today, that's the one takeaway. That's what we're growing into. That's what we're developing as we mature as Christians. Our love for God and our love for our neighbor. And so the Pharisees fail to trap him, and Jesus turns around and says, he doesn't say it, but he kind of says, now it's my turn to test you. And he asks them this question about who's more important, David or the Messiah. And the way that he words it, they can't answer, and so now they're afraid to test him anymore. And for the next week until his crucifixion, they don't really test him like that anymore. So that's chapter 22 in a nutshell. If it was a blessing, like it, share it. You know the drill. I'll see you tomorrow for chapter 23.